This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times no matter when.
Okay, thank you, Alfredo. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. You all, there you go. I'm going to let you look at the fabulous Judith Ivey and Dan Hyatt from the very first scene of the birthday party while I introduce the whole thing. I thought that might be fun for you. This is from a 2018 production that we did at ACT at the Geary, which was my, I don't know, third outing with the play. But I find the play so endlessly fascinating and resonant that every time I come back to it, interesting things happen. So I hope you had a chance to read it in the week that we were apart. If not, don't worry, because I'll sort of contextualize it and explain the plot as we go along, and as I kind of frame the play and then talk about some strategies for staging it. And as always, I'm sure you had questions as you read it. It's a rather surreal play. And so anything that you want to know that I'm not answering, please feel free to throw it in the chat. And I'm happy to, when we get to our break or whatever, take a look at all the questions, and I promise I will answer them as best I can. So the birthday party was written by Pinter. You remember I told you he was an actor in kind of dodgy repertory theater in Ireland, mostly. During the mid to late 50s. He was very poor and he never had any place to live. And each town that he went to, the way that rep worked, you got to the town you were about to perform in and you had to find your own housing. And he got to a terrible kind of dodgy town, Eastbourne, on the seaside, during a tour of, what was he playing in? I can't even remember, a provincial tour. And he didn't have a place to live. And he went to a pub to have a drink. And he met this odd man, very silent, sort of sad man, who said, well, I can tell you about a place that I stay, but I wouldn't recommend it. And Pinter had no other place to go. So he went. And he describes it. I'll read it to you. He said, there's this very big woman was the landlady, and there was a little man, the landlord, and one solitary lodger. And Pinter asked the lodger what he was doing there. And the lodger said, I'm a pianist. I used to play in the concert party here on the pier, and I gave it up. And he said the woman was voracious in his terms, and she kept tousling the silent man's hair and tickling him, and the man would get furious. And Pinter was fascinated. And when he asked the man why he didn't leave, the man replied, there's nowhere to go. And that image was so heartbreaking to Pinter and so resonant. It stayed with him really, kind of his whole life. And many years later, I think 3 years later or so, the idea came to him to go back to that story of that man and to try to imagine what would have happened had he had two people come to, I don't know, interrogate, harass, take this man away. Jerome just asked, did Pinter consider himself a follower of Kafka? And that's a perfectly timed question, thank you, because in the time that Pinter was writing this, and indeed in the time that since he left, you'll remember I told you that he went to a quite remarkable high school, the Hackney Downs School for Boys, but he never went to university. During that time, he was a voracious reader, and one of his absolute obsessions was Kafka. So the question in Kafka of kind of the quotidian nature of terror, of harassment, how you could wake up and suddenly be a cockroach, or how you could, suddenly get caught up in a kind of bureaucratic vortex in which you are being tormented or interrogated and you don't know why, and you have no idea what you've done wrong. And we all have dreams like that, right? Where you're suddenly caught in something where you keep getting questioned for something that you never did. That was utterly fascinating to Pinter. Let's remember Kafka was a Central European, kind of absurdist in some ways, the legacy that Pinter had inherited. And so, yes, I think very much that question of being in a room and there's no safety and a knock on the door comes was both a legacy of his Second World War history as a teenager in London during the Blitz and the reading he was doing at that time. So Kafka, I think, was very much on his mind. The only play he'd really written before he wrote The Birthday Party was a play called The Room, which we're going to talk about much later in our class in October, because I did it as a one act. It was his very first one act with Celebration, his most recent one act in the at 9/11, right? When Pinter was supposed to come to San Francisco to work with us on 9/11 and then couldn't come because of the tragedy. But what I will tell you about The Room is, again, Pinter wrote it while he was on tour. And it's like The Birthday Party, about a woman, in that case, a woman named Rose, his grandmother's name, very Jewish name, who's rabbiting on in a room making breakfast for her husband, Bert, just like Meg, except unlike Petey, who's kind, Bert is a thug and a kind of terrorist. And is in the room, it's about a marriage that is a kind of domestic terrorism, and how the woman finally, who doesn't even know she's in that circumstance, how she breaks out of it or longs to at the end of the play. The reason I bring up The Room is that it was done by Pinter's friend Henry Wolfe, by students in Bristol at the university. Bristol had a burgeoning and really important drama department in the 50s and 60s, where many important actors and writers came from, and where the Bristol of Vic evolved from, and where Peter O'Toole had his career, and where eventually Tom Stoppard came to review plays, and that started Tom's theater career as well. So Bristol loomed large for both Pinter and Stoppard. And the great triumph when The Room was premiered, it got reviewed, I'm sure you've heard this name, by a very famous theater critic called Harold Hobson. And Harold Hobson wrote about The Room, quote, "The play makes one stir uneasily in one's shoes and doubt for a moment the comforting solidity of the earth," which is such a great way to think about Pinter, right? That the earth suddenly starts to shake beneath your feet. And I have to say, it was quite unusual that Harold Hobson admired Pinter's work so deeply, because many people, as we're going to find out when The Birthday Party premiered, didn't get it at all and loathed it and gave it really terrible reviews. I mean, the daily press on The Birthday Party couldn't have been worse. And it was finally Hobson who again saved that play. So what was going on in Pinter's life? He was broke. He was married to Vivian Merchant, great actress. She was much more famous than he. They were living in terrible circumstances in a kind of slum in the east of London. They were the caretakers in this rundown, filthy house. That's going to play into his next play, The Caretaker. He had a son, Daniel, who was crawling around at his feet. And so the parent-child relationship was very much on his mind. The sort of terror of being broke and never surviving was very much on his mind. And yet, what was also on his mind, and I want to call your attention to this, because when we look closely at the play, you're going to see it, is he couldn't help but think about the thrillers and the kind of comedies that he was performing in at the time that he was writing the play. So we tend to think of Pinter as being so avant-garde, so Kafkaesque and unusual, so close to Beckett or the French absurdists like Ionesco, who wrote The Bald Soprano, or Arrabal, or that kind of writer. But in fact, one of the things that makes Pinter really unique is that he was a highly conventional playwright in some ways because he acted in all those plays. So the main plays he acted in were by people like Agatha Christie. He did every Agatha Christie there was, where suddenly the lights black out and you hear a scream, or there's some sound in the dark and you think, what is it? And you hear footsteps, or a flashlight goes in someone's face. All of that happens in The Birthday Party. So he was, he'd been acting in all those plays and he knew exactly how to make an audience jump. He knew what a great curtain line was because he acted in them all. He played often kind of maniacal fugitives. He played the dangerous characters. He loved acting with his back to an audience and then turning around very dramatically. And I will say this about Pinter, he loved his props. So, you know, props in a play or any hand, things you use by hand, I would say in The Birthday Party, props are incredibly iconic and sort of, as James Joyce would say, epiphanic. In other words, props can cause an epiphany, even if they're completely ordinary. And so the first image I want you to look at is the first iconic prop in The Birthday Party, which is the cornflakes box. And when you stage these plays, you have to remember that the props, and I'm going to go through them quite carefully in The Birthday Party, for instance, are the touchstones that detonate terror and laughter and connection and misunderstanding. And they're quite difficult to construct. They look completely ordinary, like the drum in The Birthday Party. You sort of think, oh, I could go out to a children's store and buy any drum, until you actually try and stage the play and realize that the drum in part one has to be so strong that Stanley can have a nervous breakdown beating on it. But part two, you have to replace the drum head with a piece of paper because Stanley has to put his foot through it and it has to be broken. Each time it's different. And this is true of the newspaper, which is another iconic prop. So these things are kind of magically deployed in the play. And these are things that Pinter was learning and doing as he was acting in the plays. Let's also remember that this was the period I told you about in which the British working class starts to make its presence felt on the British stage. And this cannot be overestimated. Let's remember that through the 30s and 40s and 50s, the main plays on the playbill were Terence Rattigan, who wrote The Deep Blue Sea, wonderful playwrights, but J.B. Priestley, Noel Coward. So loads of Noel Coward, but much more musicals, farces. Farces were big, lots of slamming doors, lots of comedies, and quite elegant. So, you know, Noel Coward's dramaturgy might have been very radical underneath, a kind of coded homosexuality happening there, and fantastic language, but disguised in a world of very elegant, you know, cocktail banter and martini glasses and cigarettes and things like that. This is not the case with a play like The Birthday Party. It's very working class. So let's remember that Meg and Petey, this is a post-war couple in the late 50s who would have been going through rationing. They've lived through the war, so they've lived through terrible times. You kind of wonder if maybe they've lost a child. There's some sorrow there that you feel with that couple. They're very lonely. They're eking out a living. You can tell. I mean, they eat cornflakes and fried bread. That's the maximum that, you know, Meg has on offer to Petey. And he's a deck chair attendant, you know, which is not exactly a high-paid career. So I think the class thing was very important to Pinter. And here's the thing that was so radical when it was first done. It's the most fascinating combination of realism and poetic metaphor. So it's in a real house with real people in a real town, eating real food. And yet there's something about it that the minute that knock on the door comes and those two men appear in their bowler hats, you know that you're in the terrain of hyperrealism, of something that is both well observed, because Pinter was a master of observation, but also larger than life. And we're going to come back to that. So what is the birthday party about? Well, it's about a couple, Meg and Petey, who run what they claim is a boarding house. So the first question the play asks is it a boarding house? She keeps saying, this is the finest house there is. This house is on the list. And you think, what list? What is a list? Is there a registry in the town upon which this house sits? Is it a list in her mind? What does it mean to be on the list? But that is her mantra. She keeps coming back to it. And then when you have that crazy exchange with Stanley, where he keeps teasing her and saying, this isn't a boarding house, it never was. And she says, yes, it was, it's on the list. And it's the best boarding house there is. He says, you've never had any guests. And she says, oh, yes, I've had. Who? One, me, so he is the only guest. He has lived in this house for 1 year. That we found out. So we are led to believe that it is possible that this birthday, again, here's another shifting piece of reality. We're told at the end of Act 1, it's Stanley's birthday. Is it Stanley's birthday? He says it isn't. She says it is. What we do know is it's the anniversary of him arriving in this house. And that anniversary is something that Meg desperately wants to mark with some kind of celebration. Meg is in her own complicated way, both his mother and in some way his lover. She describes, we've had some lovely times up there in that room. And again, you shudder to think, what are they doing up there in the afternoon while Petey's away? You kind of don't want to know. But there's a lot of sexuality and flirtation that goes on between Meg and Stanley. So he's been hiding out in this room, in this boarding house for a year. Why? We don't know. Again, Stanley's a fugitive. He's on the lam from something. There are suggestions, and it is up to us to piece the puzzle together and decide what we believe. He says he was a concert pianist, that he once gave a concert in Lower Edmonton. And that seems to have been the happiest time of his life. And then he describes the next time when he was to give a concert and they locked the hall up and he couldn't get in and they pulled a fast one on him. And you don't know whether that's paranoia or maybe it's a description of the fact that he simply had a breakdown and couldn't play anymore. We don't know. There is an edge of mental illness about Stanley. And next week, when we get to the Caretaker, watch how Aston in the Caretaker is sort of the next iteration of Stanley, a man whose mind has been broken. But the question that Pinter poses is, why was that mind broken and what was that mind to begin with? And what we do see in Stanley is an artist. He may not be a working artist. He may have been a completely failed artist, but he has a kind of artistic sensibility. And at least from his telling of it, he was a pianist who loved to play and whose identity was bound in that. And Meg knows that. And she's so longing to hear him play again and regretful. She says to Petey, oh, Stanley, a play, Stanley could have been in it if it was on the pier, and that she wishes he'd play the piano again. And that's why she gives him a drum for his birthday, because you haven't got a piano, she says. So artistry and music is important. And what else do we know about Stanley? His name is Stanley Weber. When I worked with Pinter on the play, I said to him, was he Jewish? And Pinter said, possibly. So he's in hiding from his identity, from himself, from something he's done. When the two men, Goldberg and McCann, come to the house, they interrogate him and they ask him many questions. Why did you leave your wife? What did you do about this? Why did you leave the organization? And the question is, did he abandon his wife? Did he kill his wife? Did he do something to a woman? Was he part of an organization? Was that religion? And if he left that organization, why? So we don't know the answers to this, but we do know that a man who's scared of being found is living upstairs at a house owned by these two people. And in the course of Act 1, Meg and Petey banter and have breakfast. And then Stanley comes downstairs to have his breakfast, and Petey goes out to do his deck chair attending. And Meg and Petey have and Meg and Stanley have a little flirtation, and he discovers, she says she's got to go out and go shopping because she's got to get things in for the two gentlemen. The minute that word is said, the two gentlemen, It's like a bomb drops and Stanley is terrified, absolutely terrified. Who are those gentlemen and why are they coming to get him? And he turns that terror on Meg. He starts to terrorize her. He tells her they're going to come and take her away in a wheelbarrow. That theme of being taken away in a van, in a car, in a wheelbarrow is something that is going to come up over and over again. It's going to come back again in The Caretaker with Mick. He has his own van. Aston keeps saying as if a van is something that you take someone away in, like a paddy wagon. And so he's terrified Stanley. And then Lulu arrives. And Lulu is a guest, is a neighbor, is a friend of Meg's. She's a kind of innocent, she's charming. And she brings a box. And in that box is going to be the drum. She says, you're not to open it yet. You're not to touch it. He says, why would I want to touch it? You know, so this iconic prop comes in and is left there. And Lulu has an encounter with him. And as soon as she leaves, what happens? The men arrive. Stanley hides, and these two men walk in. Who are they? Well, we don't know this either. It's a little bit like like a vaudeville joke. It's like an Irishman and a Jew walk into a pub. So you have McCann and Goldberg, and they are like stereotypical, the terrorized Irishman who only wants to drink and talk about his past, and the clever Jew who tells wild stories about gefilte fish and his childhood. You know, so in a way, they are weird stereotypes of their own histories. Goldberg is obviously the boss, and McCann is the hitman. We don't know why they're there to get Stanley. McCann is incredibly nervous about what's going to happen and what the job is. And just as they're sweating it, Meg comes in and she's so happy to see them. And Goldberg charms her and knows exactly how to talk to her. And she takes them upstairs to their room. And then finally Stanley comes back and interrogates Meg and is really disturbed. And she says they're going to have a party for Stanley for his birthday. So part 2 is that party. And there's a real altercation between Stanley, Goldberg, and McCann, very violent, very frightening, that leads up to the party. Petey is a chess player and it's his chess night, so he doesn't go to the party, which is really important, and we'll talk about that. And then this party ends up destroying Stanley through the destruction of another key prop in the play, which is his glasses. So one of the themes that we're going to explore as we talk about the play in a bit more detail is blindness. Blindness is something that comes up over and over again in Pinter. It's absolutely central to his first play, The Room. At the end of the play, the last lines of The Room, Rose says, can't see, I can't see, I can't see. Pinter himself was deeply myopic and very scared of going blind. He wore glasses all the time, and he was so the glasses in the play and Stanley's glasses are for him his defense. And when they're removed and snapped, and the sound of the glasses snapping makes you jump out of your skin, and that prop is very hard to create, you start to discover the ways in which the terrorism of those men enacts itself on Stanley. So I'm just looking, sorry, quickly at questions that I might have covered. In directing the play, did you accent parts in any way so the ACT audience would get it? Nail stretching on the blackboard. Yes, I'm going to talk about a lot of strategies we used to make the play land at the Geary. Pinter was considered part of the British New Wave, and also oddly sort of the angry young men generation, although he wasn't quite, and of Theatre of the Absurd, all of which labels he really resisted being labeled as, and you'll see as we talk about this why. For Pinter, as surreal as let's say the birthday party is, to him it was completely realistic, and he took the characters absolutely seriously. He is like Edward Albee. I would argue he's a much greater play than Edward Albee. I know that's heretical for some who adore Virginia Woolf, which is a great play, and other plays. I think that Albee's fixation with his mother, he never got past it. And his attitude towards women is so punishing. I always have a hard time getting past that with Albee. I find Albee somewhat more dated. I always think Pinter is the much more alive because he's what do I want to say, more of a playwright of observation and less a playwright of metaphor, I think, than Albee is, but we can talk about that. It is true that Goldberg and McCann are sort of members of a mob, of a kind of mafia. They're clearly members of an organization, but the question is, what organization? It's not a coincidence that he makes one a Jew and one an Irish Catholic. Pinter, although he was Jewish and proud of being Jewish later in his life and bar mitzvahed and raised Jewish, he broke with the faith after his bar mitzvah, and he deeply resisted organized religion and organized anything of any kind. He was such a kind of individualist and an anarchist in some way that he thought that the desecration of humanity was really to make individual artists or human beings fit into some organizational structure that they didn't want to belong in. And so the organization, like with the capital O, it could be the mafia, it could be politics, it could be government, it could be organized religion, all of which Stanley resists. And so in some ways, The Birthday Party is a play about the need to resist dead ideas and the inherited weight of the past. And the past is going to keep coming back to bite Stanley, to bite all of them as the play goes along. So in the play, there are many strategies of survival. Pinter is really interested in the question of resistance and resilience. So he said, the director of the play in 1958 was Peter Wood, by the way. It wasn't a happy director-writer relationship, and that was the last time he worked with Peter Wood. It's very interesting to me, and I wish someone would write on this. Pinter did much better with Peter Hall, whom he felt understood his plays much more deeply, because Peter Hall was much more exacting, and together with Peter Hall, they pursued what Pinter called the facts, the theatrical facts, without any embellishment. Peter Wood was much more fanciful, and you know whose director he was? Stoppard. So he did all of early Stoppard plays, and he did beautifully with Stoppard. They were much more, I don't know, temperamentally suited to each other. They enjoyed each other. Peter Wood was kind of a fabulist. He loved making very over-the-top scenery. I think he felt constrained by Pinter, and it wasn't his universe, which is really interesting. You know, the director-playwright relationship is like a marriage, and it's not always easy to make it work. Petey's famous last line, when he yells out, "Stan, don't let them tell you what to do." Pinter said that's the line he lived by his whole life, and that he feels very strongly that that's what the play is about. So this active resistance against, you know, organized religion and organized government is very important. And on the other hand, we can't lose the irony that both McCann and Goldberg come from the most persecuted of races, you know, the Irish, who were treated as dirt always by the English, and Jews who had just undergone the most horrific tragedy in the Second World War. So, you know, Goldberg is both a villain and a victim. So is McCann. It's never easy in Pinter. That's why he's such a great playwright. It's very nuanced. It never has a simple message. You always have to allow contradiction to happen. And that, I think, it really fascinates me. Watch the way, as we go through the play, all the characters except Petey long for a kind of lost past. And that's very interesting to me. You know, this sort of golden moment, like Stanley remembers his concert, or Goldberg remembers these golden moments from his childhood at the seaside. As soon as he gets to the seaside, he starts waxing poetical about, I remember being down at the seaside with my uncle Nat, you know, and his mother calling him in, and there on his plate was the nicest piece of gefilte fish you could ever see on a plate. You know, he has that kind of these memories of that. Lulu, during the party scene, remembers her first love. It's the past is a kind of buttress against the horrors of the present for these characters, but in fact, in the end, it doesn't really save them. So The Birthday Party, this mysterious play, which in its third act shows the man who has resisted getting taken away in a big black car by two men, and a woman who loves him desperately in total denial that he's gone. That play opened in April 58 in Cambridge at the Arts Club in Cambridge, produced by a very young man named Michael Codron, who became a famous producer. And it went to Wolverhampton on tour, and it was quite acclaimed until it got to London. And it absolutely got killed. Here are a few lines from some of the press. "What all this means," said one critic for the Daily Telegraph, "only Mr. Pinter knows for sure, for his characters speak in non sequiturs, half gibberish, and lunatic ravings." Another said, "Who the two strangers are, who Monty is, where they are all going, matters which may be lucidly clear to Mr. Pinter. But he has certainly not divulged them to me," said the critic from the Daily Times. So they were scathing. They felt that Pinter was trying to put one over on them, that they didn't get it, that it was meaningless and peculiar. They didn't know who to root for. They didn't think it was funny. And it was very sad. It lasted 6 performances. That's all. And on the Thursday matinee, Pinter went to see it, and the dress circle was closed because there was no one there, and he was late, and he went upstairs, and the usher said to him, what are you doing here? And he said, "I'm the author." And she looked at him and said, "Oh, come in, you poor, poor man." So, and then Harold Hobson was there that day. And again, as he did with The Room, Hobson wrote the most extraordinary review. And this is a bit of it. He said, this is in the Sunday Times. So in London, there were daily papers that came out right away. And then there were 2 very important Sunday papers. And in the Sunday Times, Hobson wrote about the birthday party, "It breathes in the air. It cannot be seen, but it enters the room every time the door is open. There is something in your past, it does not matter what, which will catch up with you. Though you go to the uttermost parts of the earth and hide yourself in the most obscure lodgings in the least popular of towns, one day there is a possibility that 2 men will appear. They will be looking for you and you cannot get away. And someone will be looking for them too. There is terror everywhere." I thought about that so much because I started my book on Pinter and Stoppard the day of the COVID lockdown. And I thought that terror that we all felt sitting at home alone with something terrifying in the air that we couldn't see, but we knew was there and made everybody panic. It sort of felt like nothing else but Pinter to me. And so anyway, that was the day I started. So, what happened is the play was sort of a total failure in the short term, but in the long term, people started to get very curious about this writer. And one theory of why it failed so much that we'll talk about when we look at images of the play is that because Peter Wood didn't quite trust it, he set it in a very odd way. He set it in this giant set, which was a conservatory with big glass panes, and you could see out the window. And Pinter kept saying, "I've never been in any bedsit anywhere in the seaside that looks like this." And he knew somehow the set was totally wrong, and that Peter Wood wasn't interested in the kind of specificity of the language and of the characters. And Peter Wood kept saying it had to be grotesque in order to work. And William Friedkin made the same mistake. So Friedkin did a film of the birthday party, which some of you may have seen, or you can easily access it on Criterion or whatever. And it also, it's interesting to see, but it completely plays up the horror film aspect. Now, there is certainly plenty of that. In the play. It is sort of structured like a horror movie, but what makes it moving and real, and I think a really important play, is that it also centers around characters who are absolutely real. And if you don't make that banal living room a real sitting room, then it can't open up to the sort of horrors of modern history. You have to start with the realistic in order to go to the surreal. So that has to do with how I would say a director approaches the play. And the first question to really ask is, what does the universe of the play look like? And given that it was written in 1958, do you need to set it in its period? This is always a major question for a director with any play written before the present. And there's no right answer. Just as when you do Shakespeare, you can set it in Elizabethan dress, which would have been modern dress to his own time, or you can set it in modern dress for our time. Neither does damage to the play. Both can work absolutely. It depends on how you interpret the play. I would say, with Pinter, or at least in my experience, in the early Pinter, it helps to keep it somewhat in its period for this reason. Obviously, it's a period before cell phones, before media, where somebody believed he could actually hide out in a remote place and not be caught. Now, certainly post-COVID, the idea of everybody being locked down in their own private houses is resonant anyway, and you could certainly do the play in any context, but it's also a play about English poverty in a certain moment in English history, as I talked to you about before, in which rationing was very acute and the country was kind of desperate to survive. So here's one thing that I learned very early on doing Pinter. They are written like little ballets. They are extremely specific in terms of their stage direction and their indication of the power dynamics of who stands, who sits, who turns his back to the audience, who looks, who blinks, all of that. And in some way, as with dance notation, you kind of have to honor that if you want the menace, the danger, the rubber band to be pulled really tight. So in designing a set, you want to make everything on the set real, but not so detailed that other things can't emerge. In other words, if there are too many tchotchkes, if there are too many images on the wall, then the things that you want to have pop don't pop. And I'm going to go to the PowerPoint now and show you that the first image here, whoops, let's go back, is Meg peeking through this the kitchen hatch. So Pinter describes this very clearly, and I think he does it because Meg is like a puppet. She's like a little doll that keeps popping through the puppet stage and then disappearing again. So the very first time you see her, she's behind the hatch, and the description is, Petey enters from the door on the left with a paper, and the newspaper is going to be extremely important, and sits at the table. He begins to read. Meg's voice comes through the kitchen hatch. So first, you don't even see her. You hear a voice off stage in the puppet theater, and she says, "Is that you, Petey?" And then there's the famous Pinter pause. And then she repeats, "Petey, is that you?" And then there's another pause. And she says, "Petey." And he finally answers, "What?" She says, "Is that you?" He says, "Yes, it's me." And then she says, "What?" It's a total vaudeville routine. And then her face appears. And that's the moment. That smiling face peers through the hatch. And she says, "Are you back?" And he says, "Yes." Okay, so right away, what do we learn? We learn that conversation, dialogue in Pinter has nothing to do with information, and it has nothing to do with the facts. It's something else entirely. Because if it were a naturalistic playwright, if it were almost any other playwright, when the first character said, "Is that you, Petey?" the second character would say, "Yes, it's me," right? That's what you say in a naturalistic play. So why not? Why doesn't Petey say that? "Is that you, Petey?" Pause. So what is Petey doing? It's not that he doesn't hear her, but he doesn't answer. Why not? Then she repeats it again. "Petey, is that you?" And he doesn't answer again. And you think, what the hell's going on here? What kind of play is this? And then she says for the third time, "Petey?" And he finally says, "What?" And then he makes her repeat it. "Is that you?" And finally, only on the fourth time, he says, "Yes, it's me." And that is like the puppet's cue to appear. And she says, "What?" And then she pops out. So it's a game. It's the game they play every morning. It's their routine. It's a routine that keeps these two people who are scared to death about the world, who have nothing really to live for, who have no money, who have a sad and strange and disassociated man living upstairs as their guest. It's how they keep themselves going. And Petey knows that that's the game, and he knows that's how Meg wants it played, and that every day they kind of go through the same routine. It's a rhythmic thing. It's a little piece of stage poetry. It's absolutely brilliant, and you can't let anything interfere with it. You can't move around. You can't distract it, because it is its own little distilled kind of exorcism, you know. And finally, when he says yes, she says, I've got your cornflakes ready. And she appears and says, here's your cornflakes. And that is Meg's way of offering herself to the world. So remember that this was a period in which breakfast cereal was a very new thing. It was also expensive. It has that very iconic box, white and yellow and green with the rooster. So when you do the play today, you got to make that box be the thing that pops. Why is it important that it pops? Because the cornflake symbolizes Meg's tether with reality. It is how she loves Petey and how she loves Stanley. It's how she takes care of them. When we get to part 3 and the cornflakes box is empty and she says, oh, I have no cornflakes. I'm out of cornflakes. I have no cornflakes left. You realize that the whole house of cards has come down. The cornflakes stands in for everything. And on the first European tour of this play, the woman who described playing Meg said they had to travel around Europe with boxes of cornflakes because they couldn't get them anywhere else. Okay, so so there's Petey's little game with her, and then they have the routine they always have. He rises, he takes the plate, he props the paper up so he can read the paper, and he starts to eat. She comes in, she says, are they nice? Very nice. I thought they'd be nice. Okay, so that's the second part of the routine. And then she says, you got your paper. Of course he has his paper, right? But this is her connective tissue, right? Now, what you realize watching Petey is silence is important to Petey, and he would love to simply be silent. He would love to be left alone to read his paper. But Meg needs a certain amount of response in order to get through her day. And part of the routine is she keeps asking him to read the paper out loud to her. Now, remember this, because the newspaper is going to be part of the kind of quotidian world of the play that is very precious to Meg and Petey, and that paper becomes weaponized when it's left on the table, and the McCann, the thug, the killer, starts to tear it up into strips. And the strips at the end of the play that fall to the ground like the feathers of a dead bird, that's the broken mind of Meg and the end of Stanley. So that newspaper, which is a totally ordinary newspaper, is going to be extremely important in the play. And again, I would say, watch the props. There can't be a million other things on the table, so that newspaper propped up on the sugar bowl or whatever, looking at that newspaper centers you. And remember this, in any working class town, in America, in Britain, in the old days, the newspaper was sort of the way that people could connect with their broader community. And there was gossip in the paper that they were fascinated by, whether or not they knew who the people were. She gets all excited when she says, what are you reading? And he says, someone's just had a baby. Oh, they haven't. Who? And he says, some girl. Oh, Petey, who? He says, I don't think you'd know her. What's her name? He says, Lady Mary Splat. And then she says, I don't know her. And it's such a great comic line. Of course she doesn't know her. They don't know anybody. They certainly don't know anybody called Lady Mary Splat. But the connective tissue makes them feel connected to the world. And it lets Meg feel that there's a universe out there of which she is a part. So watch for that newspaper. It's going to be valuable. And then they talk about Stanley. And again, watch, it's like a little piece of stage poetry. She says, listen to the prepositions, because only in English could you move prepositions around this way. Is Stanley up yet? I don't know. Is he? I don't know. She says, I haven't seen him down yet. Petey says, well then, he can't be up. Meg says, haven't you seen him down? Petey says, I've only just come in. Meg says, he must be still asleep. So the up, down, in, out is absolutely masterful, but it's also, it's the game of what's up with Stanley. And so we get introduced to this sort of mysterious person up above. And then comes the game of the fried bread. And I want to use that to show you another thing that in terms of the design and the world of the play that I learned from working with Pinter, which is that if you're going to keep the language taught and the game, and remember that game playing is central to Pinter as it is to Stoppard, the rules of the game, how to keep up a game, how to protect yourself from losing in a game, that life is all a game, blind man's buff, charades, cricket, you name it. They loved, and that game playing is a central device to Pinter's dramaturgy. It's going to be the same thing in The Homecoming, which we're going to look at. So the game here is that fried bread is going to be a surprise. So she says, she offers him the plate and she says, "Here you are, PT." And he takes it and he sits. And then here's the dialogue. "Is it nice?" she asks. Petey says, "I haven't tasted it yet." Meg says, "I bet you don't know what it is." Petey says, "Yes, I do." Meg says, "What is it then?" Petey says, "Fried bread." And she says, "That's right." Now, every morning they do the same thing. Of course, she knows that he knows that it's fried bread. And it's fried bread. It's disgusting. It's nothing. It's just cold bread fried up in lard. But the routine tells you something about Meg, which is, and Pinter said this in rehearsal, I loved it, everything's always new for Meg. He told us that he thought she'd forgotten how to read. She forgets everything. Everything is always for the first time. She lives completely in the present tense, which is why she's so vulnerable. She doesn't remember bad things that happen. She doesn't even remember being insulted when Stanley's horrible to her. She starts right over again with the game. And so you have to be absolutely still. If she's moving around on this thing about the fried bread, the joke doesn't land. It's very taut. Then that's right, she can sit. And he says, "Very nice. I knew it was." So there's a kind of specific, it's like where you pull the strings of the puppet. And when Petey feels that she's sufficiently placated and they've had a routinized morning, he can drop his bombshell, which is, "Oh, Meg, 2 men came up to me on the beach last night." And she looks at him and says, "2 men?" Now, you would think he just said an atomic bomb just dropped, but it is. They don't know people. They never meet people. They don't see people. Nobody comes to their house. And Petey tries to be casual. "Yes, they wanted to know if we could put them up for a couple of nights." And she says, "Put them up here?" As if, why would that happen, right? How do we know? I mean, what? He says, "Yes." "How many men?" "2. "What did you say?" "Well, I said I didn't know." So they said they'd come round to find out. And Meg says, "Are they coming?" Petey says, "Well, they said they would." And then she makes a discovery. "Had they heard about us, Petey?" He says, "They must have done." And she says, "Yes, they must have done. They must have heard this was a very good boarding house. It is. This house is on the list." And then we're back to a kind of safety. Do you see what I mean? So if life is dangerous and there's always the chance of something unknown happening that you won't be able to control, whether it's the emotional thing that happens between 2 people or a house being invaded, you have to get back on safe territory. And safe territory are the routines that you know, what you eat, what you say to each other, or repeated speech like "it's on the list." So they just repeat that. And then comes my absolutely favorite part of this scene. I think it's so hilarious. It's and so moving about Stanley. He says, he's reading the paper, and he says, "There's a new show coming to the palace." And Meg says, "On the pier?" He says, "No, the palace in the town." And she, with great regret, and it tells you how much she loves Stanley, she says, "Stanley could have been in it if it was on the pier." So he says, "This is a straight show." "What do you mean?" asks Meg. He says, "No dancing or singing." And then she says, "What do they do then?" And he says, "They just talk." And it's such a wonderful meta theatrical commentary on his own play. When people said, "What does it mean? Who are these people? What are they doing?" It's just they just talk. They're just 2 people sitting there talking. So that gives you the kind of landscape of the early part of the play. And then Stanley comes down and they have their encounter. And then you'll see in the way that we designed the set, I did it so that there is a room and a little staircase going upstairs. And then there's a wall so you can see the outside. And the reason I did that is because in a stage as huge as the Geary, it is really difficult to make the tension as kind of taut and dramatic as you need it to be, so that a mere knock on the door makes you jump out of your skin, because it just looks like a big box set. So I tried to make the set quite small. It had a ceiling and walls, so it was contained. And when the knock on the door comes, you feel the danger of what's outside. So Marcia's writing, I watched it on YouTube and I found it uninteresting. I think you can't see Pinter on a screen because you don't get the fundamental genius of it, which is that within the confines of a room, anything can happen and a whole universe can come crashing down, and that strangers arriving in the room can bring love or they can bring absolute horror or everything in between, and that it's also like a puppet stage and incredibly funny. And I think that's very hard to get on film because film is inherently naturalistic or it's horror. And so I agree with you that I think it's tough watching Pinter on a screen, but there are things to look for. So here's something to look for. She arrives, Lulu, and look at her. She's a big girl, and Meg's going out shopping, and she has this big parcel, and it's wrapped in paper. And doesn't it look like a bomb? You think, what the hell is that thing? And why is she carrying it? And Stanley is up against the door. You see Firdos. This was Firdos Bomji playing Stanley. Well, he's listening. And I deliberately, I want to say, in the second time I did, this is the third time I did the play. The first time I did it with David Strathairn, a wonderful actor I've worked with a lot, and you may remember him from ACT Productions, many that we did. But I was really excited to cast Firdos, who did Indian Ink of Tom Stoppard for us, because I thought, what would happen if it were a person of color who was the one who was being hunted? And it did make it incredibly resonant. And that goes to how casting, can impact a play. I'll just take a little sidebar here to say that directors will always tell you that casting is 80% of the success of any play. I think in Pinter, it is uniquely challenging. You need actors who have incredibly good language skills, incredibly good comic timing, extremely controlled physical life. It helps if they've done clowning or improvisation. And I will say, which sounds like a truism, they have to all be evenly matched. So in The Birthday Party, you would think, well, Lulu is the small role. She's only in the second half of Act 2 and the first half of Act 3. It can't be that important. Lulu is absolutely critical. Lulu is the one you watch in real time be manipulated and destroyed by Goldberg and then have to defend herself. So she's absolutely critical. And I wanted Lulu, he says to her, Lulu, you're a big bouncy girl. Come and sit on my lap, he says in part 2. So I cast the tallest actress I could find. I loved it that Lulu towered over Meg. The physical comedy of it was really interesting, that she was bigger than Scott Wentworth, who played Goldberg, and that she could sort of hold her own. So I gave her a big 50s hairdo, and she's carrying this big prop. And there is Stanley standing there, sort of curious, nervous. Now, hi, Christy. Christy's asking, how did you know to make the set contained? I would say, Christy, that the nature of the room as a prison, as a fortress, as a safety zone, and as something to be breached is the poetic frame of Pinter. If it's too big or too detailed, or there are too many escape routes, then the pressure cooker, which is that room, is less potent. It's like a teapot that where the steam already goes out. The challenge of a theater like the Geary is that it is enormous, and it's hard to contain tension. What's even harder, I will say, is to do Pinter in a thrust stage. Do you know what I mean by a thrust stage? So I just did the Lehman trilogy, first in the proscenium of the Huntington Theater, and then I had to restage the whole play just now in St. Louis in a thrust. What's really hard about a thrust, which is a stage where the audience is on three sides, is that you really can't contain tension in the same way, because however taut you try to make the stage action, the audience is on the other side. So you have to have very different strategies. And here's one thing about the birthday party and a thrust. When I first did it at CSC, my theater in New York, that was a thrust, audience on three sides. So I couldn't make a door stage right that led to the stairs going up because the audience was there. So what I did was actually build the stairs that went to a balcony above the audience where the actors exited. Well, Pinter had never seen his plays done in a thrust. They were always meant to be in a conventional proscenium theater because he was a conventional proscenium actor. He did Agatha Christie in a proscenium. That's what he was used to. So he sat there looking completely mystified, fascinated. Peter Riegert, the wonderful Peter Riegert, was playing Goldberg, and Gene Stapleton was playing Meg. And he kept watching them go up and down the stairs. Now, if you've ever read Pinter, what happens upstairs is always terrifying. You want to say to those characters, don't go upstairs. Something really bad will happen to you, whether it's what Ruth does to the boys in The Homecoming, or what Goldberg does to Stanley and Lulu in this play, in The Birthday Party. Just don't go upstairs. So he watched the stairs, and then Pinter finally stopped and said, Peter, I wonder if you could add a line for me. And Peter was so excited, he didn't know what to say. This was Harold Pinter giving him a line. And he said, yes, Harold, what shall I say? And Pinter said, stop on the stairs, turn around and look at Meg and say, what a lovely flight of stairs. So that was what he added when we did it at CSC. He was very interested in the problem of staging his work in a thrust. So I kept the stairs. And if you see there, that staircase is not indicated in the original. It's just a door. But I wanted you to see the stairs that go upstairs. And I also wanted Meg to have a landing platform for when she appears with the drum. So note the drum. Note also right by the stairs is that little shoebox, because that's going to be a place to perch on. That's going to be really important. That in the footstool are iconic props in part 2. Now, here's what happens when that prop gets open. So here's Stanley and Meg at the end of part 1. And she is so in love with him. She has ordered this child's drum as a present for him. And I find it incredibly moving that she feels that she needs to give it to him because he's so terrified about these two men coming. And she keeps saying, they won't bother you, Stan. They're very nice men. So finally, she says, you mustn't be sad today. It's your birthday. He says, huh? It's your birthday, Stan. I was going to keep it a secret till tonight. And he says, no. She says, it is. I bought you a present. Here, go on, open it. And she goes and she brings this drum. And he says, what's this? It's your present. This isn't my birthday, Meg. Of course it is, she says. Open your present. And he says, it's a drum, a boy's drum. And Meg says to him something I think is one of the most loving things that a character could ever say, a mother to her child. She says, it's because you haven't got a piano. So she knows he's broken, and she knows he's heartbroken to have given up his music. She can't give him a piano. So she gives him a drum, which is ridiculous, but it's also incredibly generous and loving. And for a moment, he's really moved by it. And he says, shall I put it around my neck? And he does. And he even, gives her a kiss. She says, aren't you going to give me a kiss? And he kisses her, and she says, there's sticks in there, and he starts to play it. So he opens it and looks at it, and it just looks like nothing. It's just, it's a toy. And then he goes completely mad, and he starts banging that drum, and all of the terror that he feels about his life, about the men coming to take him away, about his mind slipping, about the horror of the world, this post-war world where nothing means anything anymore, erupts. And he starts banging that drum like a madman. And Meg expresses dismay. He arrives at her chair, banging the drum, his face and the drumbeat now savage and possessed. Blackout. End of Act 1. So that prop, that magical prop, it has to be so strong because that actor is going to smash it at the end of every first act. And at the intermission, stage management has to run very quickly and replace the drum head. And we'll see why. So it's 2. Let's take our break and go take 5 minutes and do what you need to do. And we'll come back and take on Act 2.
Thanks, Professor. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Professor, go ahead and take it away.
Okay. Okay, so let us head into part 2. And here I want you to see, oh, do I need to share my screen again? So here are the men. So I just want to say a word. This is Marco Baricelli. You remember wonderful Marco Baricelli playing McCann, and Scott Wentworth, great Canadian actor, playing Goldberg. In the original, Harold had them in bowler hats, both of them in bowler hats, and they were much more iconic, this sort of vaudeville act. And he said to me when we did it in New York, take off the bowler hats, just let them, you know, or at least McCann, let him look like a real Irishman. Irishmen don't wear bowler hats. We don't have to label it so precisely that they are, you know, villains with a capital V. And I like that because it felt subtler to me and sort of more interesting to play it that way. And so here they come, and just look at their faces as soon as they arrive. They are a double act. And from the very beginning, what you realize is that they don't know really what they're doing there, or at least McCann certainly doesn't know what he's doing there. And it's such a metaphor for life, right? You have a task, you have a job, you turn up to do it, but you're not really sure what the job is, what it will entail, whether it will be dangerous or not. And you keep asking of the authority figure, tell me, just tell me. McCann keeps saying, just tell me what I have to do, and then I'll be, and Goldberg won't tell him, and you know, whatever. So McCann is a very anxious Irishman. And this is the scene with Marco at the top of Act 2 of the play. And I'll just tell you a funny story about that, because it tells you how precise and meticulous it is to direct a Pinter play. You remember I told you about the iconic prop of the cornflakes box, and the same thing with the eyeglasses, which we're going to see in this act, and the drum. Well, the newspaper is also iconic. It has to just look like a tabloid, like any British, lower middle class, whatever it is, the Sun, whatever the tabloid is. However, it has to tear into 5 even strips. Now, you might ask, why? What is that? What does that mean? And Pinter never explains it. He just says, here's the description from the top of part 2. McCann is sitting at the table, tearing a sheet of newspaper into 5 equal strips. It is evening. After a moment, Stanley enters from the left. He stops, he watches him, and then he speaks, right? And then McCann keeps tearing paper, and Stanley is staring at him. So you think, what is that? Well, what's wonderful, and it's what Beckett originally wrote about Joyce when he said, it is not about the thing, it is the thing itself. That's what's so amazing about Pinter. It's not a metaphor of something else. It is exactly what you see, which is a terrified and very violent man is trying to calm his nerves as best he can by doing this kind of mind game with himself. It has to be absolutely equal strips. You know, have you ever done that kind of game? Or it's like you don't step on a crack, or you only recite every 3rd line, whatever it is, to just calm your mind. This is what McCann does. And Stanley looks at it and sees in that bizarre ritualized game vulnerability. And he goes near it to touch the paper. And McCann says, mind that, don't touch that. And right away, Stanley sees, aha, this is where this man is actually vulnerable. What can I do? So it's kind of wonderful that Stanley, who's the victim at the end of Act 1, becomes the victimizer in part 2 at the top. And they have a very nasty little encounter, he and McCann, and he tries to make friends with McCann. He tries to pretend that he knows Ireland, and he does a variety of strategies to get the upper hand. And this is where you understand something about Pinter, which was very brilliantly written about. The only critic I've ever found who's to me, useful on Pinter is a professor at Columbia University named Austin Quigley, Quigley, Austin Quigley. And he wrote a book many years ago, but he's still working today, called The Pinter Problem. And what I found so brilliant about it, and I've used it ever since in directing Pinter, is he talks about language in a sort of Wittgenstein sense as being a tool, as being not a confessional thing, but an active weapon to be used against or with another human being. And so language is always strategy. It's not about information, as I said to you about Meg and Petey in the beginning of the play. And it only exists in relation to another human being. So his argument about Pinter is that no character exists without his or her double. So if you look closely, the plays always come in pairs. You have Meg and Petey, you also have Meg and Stanley, you have Goldberg and McCann, right? So they always come in clusters. And Stanley tries to insert himself in the duo, which is McCann and Goldberg, by persuading McCann that maybe he's the one to befriend and that they could all go have a drink together and go get a Guinness down the road and leave these crazy people behind. So it's always strategies, right, about another person to break up a couple and to try and claim territory over and over and over again. And you sort of think, oh, maybe Stanley's going to win this one. He says, this is a ridiculous house to pick on. McCann says, why? Stanley says, because it's not a boarding house. It never was. McCann says, sure it is. Stanley says, why did you choose this house? And, and it goes on and on like this. He says it isn't his birthday. He says he refuses to stay there for the party. And then he starts to try and get near that newspaper, and McCann starts to really lose it. And Goldberg walks in and realizes that the power dynamic has been upended, and he's got to do something to put Stanley in his place. And he says, are you the manager here? Stanley says, that's right. And Goldberg says, which is a really important line, is it a good game? So that word game, notice it over and over and over again. That is one person's way of saying to another one, I know you're playing a game and I know what the game is and I'm going to win. Nick is going to say the same thing when he invades the room in The Caretaker. He's going to sit on the bed and say to Davies, so what's the game? It's such a scary thing because it unmasks the other character very quickly. And so then we get a clue about Goldberg. So I just want you to listen for a moment to the kind of genius of Goldberg's language. Do you remember that I quoted a speech that Pinter gave last time in which he said that there are two kinds of silence? One is a torrent of language, and the other is when nobody says anything at all. Well, that is very fascinating because in this case, you get two kinds of language. Stanley is so terrified of McCann that he resorts to incredible violence and lifts up that chair, and they're about to bludgeon each other because he has no language in order to beat McCann. And then in comes Goldberg. Well, Meg is about to come with her drum, but right before that, Goldberg interrupts and says, what makes you think I'm deaf? As a matter of fact, every single one of my senses is at its peak. Not bad going, eh, for a man past 50. But a birthday, I always feel, is a great occasion. Taken too much for granted these days. What a thing to celebrate. Birth, like getting up in the morning. Marvelous. And then, in pretending to talk about a birthday, he completely kneecaps Stanley with the following lines. Some people, he says, staring at Stanley, don't like the idea of getting up in the morning, and he knows exactly who he's talking to. I've heard them. Getting up in the morning, they say, what is it? Your skin's crabby, you need a shave, your eyes are full of muck, your mouth is like a bog house, the palms of your hands are full of sweat, your nose is clogged up, your feet stink. What are you but a corpse waiting to be washed? Such a terrifying thing to say to Stanley, who's in terror of these men. Whenever I hear that point of view, says Goldberg, I feel cheerful because he takes the upper hand, right? Because I know what it is to wake up with the sun shining, to the sound of the lawnmower, all the little birds, the smell of the grass, church bells, tomato juice. And Stanley says, get out. Stanley cannot combat that kind of language. Goldberg is the master of these endless monologues that go on about nothing, about his youth, about his past, but they're also coded ways of saying to Stanley, I know who you are. I know you're just a corpse waiting to be washed, and I'm going to win this conflict. So don't fucking mess with me. So it gets very scary. But McCann doesn't know what to do. And he says, Nat, to Goldberg, what? He won't sit down. Well, ask him. I've asked him. Ask him again. McCann says, sit down. Why? You'd be more comfortable. So would you. So that Lotsie, sit down, stand up. Who has the power to make another person do anything? Particularly the simplest act of sitting down is an act that Stanley doesn't want to succumb to. Well, they start to have a huge interrogation. They're incredibly violent, the two men, to Stanley. They ask him all kinds of questions. Why did you come to this place? Where did you come from? Why did you come here? Why did you stay? Over and over and over again. They take his glasses. They tell him he's a fake. They say, why did you kill your wife? How did you kill her? It's when did you last pray? And Pinter said to us, when we asked him what all this meant, he said, listen, if you accuse somebody of enough things, they will be guilty of one of them. So Stanley is absolutely terrified, and he is completely broken down, crouching in his chair. He kicks Goldberg in the stomach. They start to fight with the chairs. It's an absolutely primal Greek violent moment. And what happens? Meg appears with the drum. And suddenly that drum, which was the locus of violence and despair on the part of Stanley in the end of Act 1, becomes the party moment. And you hear that drum, and Meg's all dressed up in her party dress, and she says, I brought the drum down, I'm dressed for the party. And you think, oh my God, they can't kill him now, because look at this woman, his mother, the mother figure. Goldberg says, wonderful. And she says, you like my dress? And he says, wonderful, out of this world. Stanley says, could I have my glasses? Because he's blind without it. And Goldberg keeps flattering Meg, you look like a gladiola, and they start drinking. And Meg gives a wonderful speech about his birthday, and then they decide to play a game. Well, you know the minute the game starts, it is not going to go well. Goldberg is in the corner there, Lulu all dressed up. He's pawing her. She adores him. She says, you look like my father. There's a big romance going there. And they start to play blind man's buff. And blindness, as we've seen, is a huge theme in the play. Stanley is absolutely terrified because he knows that this game is not a game, but is a territorial attack on him and his own person and his body and his vision. And in this moment, McCann, who's blindfolded, takes Stanley's glasses and he snaps them. And that is the beginning of the end. Stanley is utterly terrified. Stanley then has to be the blinded one. And they get more and more bound up in the kind of nightmare of this game. And like a horror movie, suddenly the lights go out. And Pinter is very adept at manipulating blackouts. We're going to see this all over the Caretaker. And Lulu screams, the lights, what happened? The lights, wait a minute, where is he? Let go of me. Who's this? Someone's touching me, right? So it's like almost a potential sexual assault. Where is he? Why has the light gone out? Where's your torch? Meaning your flashlight. And McCann starts spraying his torch around. It gets knocked out of his hand by Stanley. And suddenly you hear grunting and violence. And Goldberg keeps saying, what is it? What is it? It's Lulu. She screams. She falls on the ground. Where is she? She fell. Where? About here. Help me pick her up. I can't find her. She must be somewhere. She's not here. She must be. She's gone. McCann finds the torch. He shines it on the table at Stanley. Lulu is lying spread-eagled on the table. Stanley bent over her. Stanley begins to giggle, and then they back him against the wall. And you watch his mind snap. And that's the party. That's the end of the party. And then what happens? And here he is. These are other scenes from that earlier in the party when the flashlight is in his face and Meg is oblivious and having a wonderful time. And he is trying to hold on to anything that he can. That's going to come later. And now we get to part 3. So in part 3, it feels as if, oh, we're back to kind of normalcy, right? It's morning. And Meg starts it almost just like she starts part 1. Is that you, Stan? Stanny? Yes, is that you? And then PD says, it's me. And the disaster happens. I've run out of cornflakes. And if you've set up the cornflakes right in part 1, and if you've done that routine to really heighten that the cornflakes exchange is how love is transacted in this house, when she runs out of cornflakes and he says, what else have you got? And she says, nothing. And Petey says, nothing. You realize the gentleman had the last of the fry this morning. It's such an image of the gentleman has destroyed this house. Stanley hasn't come down. She's about to go shopping. Petey really wants her to go shopping. She's scared to death to go out because she sees that black car. She remembers the wheelbarrow in the van. She thinks she's the one that's about to be taken away for a ride. Goldberg comes down the stairs. They jump out of their skin because they think it's going to be Stanley, but it's just Goldberg. And even Goldberg seems shaken. It has not gone the way they thought it was going to go. McCann says, I gave him his glasses. Goldberg says, wasn't he glad to get them back? McCann says, the frames are bust. And Goldberg says, how did that happen? So none of it has gone the way they thought. And finally, Petey comes in. And what's so important and moving about this scene is Petey. And again, remember I said to you, there are no small actors in Pinter. You think Petey, who is Petey? He's just the old man. You have to cast an actor that can absolutely deliver the most resistance-laden scene in the play. When Goldberg tries to get rid of him, tries to make him go and attend to his peas, tries to make him not pay attention, and he can't do it because Petey sniffs that something's really gone wrong. McCann tries to calm himself down. He tries to rip the paper. Goldberg starts screaming, stop doing that. And Goldberg says, I'm knocked out. I feel I'm knocked out. And McCann doesn't know what to do. And he does the ultimate sin in Pinter. He calls him Simey, which is the name that he has been called, Goldberg, in his own monologues about his mom. But Goldberg looks at him murderously and says, don't call me that. Never call me that. And McCann is terrified. And finally, he has to save Goldberg. So Goldberg needs the breath of life. And the breath of life, the moment when McCann breathes in his mouth, it is literally because Goldberg realizes he has nothing left. He's hollow inside. He's a completely empty human being. You will remember that I talked to you about speech and silence. Well, finally, when he says, because I believe that the world, he has just recited the biggest chain of cliches ever, right? I'm telling you, follow my line, follow my mental, learn by heart, never write down a thing, and don't go too near the water. All cliches, right? And you'll find that what I say is true because I believe that the world vacant, because I believe that the world desperate, because I believe that the world, then Pinter writes, lost. And there is a huge silence. And what you realize is he believes nothing. He has no beliefs and he knows it. He's just an empty windbag. And McCann knows it and blows in his mouth. And then down comes Stanley. And Stanley has been dressed in a suit, perfectly put together, but his mind has been utterly broken. And he's about to get taken away. And this remarkable thing happens. They try to buoy him up. They try to tell him that everything's going to be okay. They give him the ridiculous routine of, we're going to give you everything you need. And he ends with a tiny moment of resistance when he says, just caca shit, he says to them. What's your opinion of such a prospect? Shit. Stanley isn't entirely broken. And then comes Petey. And when Petey walks in and sees this scene, he says, where are you taking him? We're taking him to Monty, says Goldberg. Petey says, he can stay here. Goldberg says, don't be silly. We can look after him here. Goldberg says, why do you want to look after him? And Petey says, which is so remarkable, he's my guest. And I think that's Pinter's way of saying, you know, there is some humanity in the world, even after the Holocaust. There are people who save other people, who try to save other people, who at least extend themselves. And when he doesn't listen, when Goldberg takes him away, he screams that famous line, "Don't let them tell you what to do." It's quite remarkable. And you'll see now the whole set and the spareness of the set, so that each actor is like a set piece, standing there, creating this incredibly violent chessboard on which the disaster is played out. So, and the very last moments of the play, the sort of, I would say, I don't know, the catharsis when Meg comes in is that she, there's no way in the world that Meg can compass the disaster of what's happened. And so she creates a fantasy. And I think that illusion is an enormous part of this play. The illusion that things are going to be okay, that normalcy will be restored when we have seen a human being be completely decimated. She says, "Have they gone?" "Yes." "Won't they be in for lunch?" "No." "Oh, what a shame." "What are you doing?" He says, "Reading." "Is it good?" "All right." Poor Petey, he doesn't know what to do except lie. "Where's Stan?" she says. There's a pause. That pause is so important. Is he going to tell the truth? What is he going to say? The audience's eye goes from Meg to Petey. He says nothing. She repeats, "Is Stan down yet, Petey?" And then there's an ellipsis. He doesn't know what to say. "No, ... he's ... Is he still in bed?" she says, hopefully. And that gives him a way out. And he says, "Yes, he's still asleep." So Petey makes a decision. I'm going to spare her. For as long as I can, I will spare her. And she says, "Still, he's late for his breakfast." That's a routine that reassures her. He's always late for his breakfast. And Petey says, "Let him sleep." And in a way, that's like saying, put to bed your memory of this man. And what might well happen, and we don't know, is that Meg, who never remembers everything, for whom everything is new, will forget that she ever had him there. Or she'll remember that once upon a time she had a boy. Maybe she'll remember it was her boy. Maybe she'll remember the concerts. And we don't know. Or maybe she'll be destroyed when she goes upstairs and finds an empty room. We have no idea. Meg says, "Wasn't it a lovely party last night?" Petey says, "I wasn't there." And she's forgotten that. "Weren't you?" "I came in afterwards." "Oh." And then there's a pause. And then she reclaims the memory. "It was a lovely party. I haven't laughed so much for years. We had dancing and singing and games. You should have been there." He says, "It was good, eh?" And she says, "I was the belle of the ball." "Were you?" "Oh, yes. They all said I was." "I bet you were, too." "Oh, it's true, I was." She says, pause. "I know I was." So it's an absolutely heartbreaking end to this astonishing play, because it's so emotionally true. There are no answers. But there are characters we've come to love in a way and understand. We don't have to ask, as I said to you in the first lecture, about their biographies or their past. We don't have to know everything there is to know about Meg and Petey's marriage or Stanley's background, or indeed about Goldberg and McCann's reasons for taking Stanley, to feel that in the present tense, in 2 hours, because these are short plays, something profound and palpable has happened. We have watched it. We have watched man's inhumanity to man. We have watched man's salvation to another man. We've watched a mother love and revere her child. And we've watched a child desperately trying to make his way in the world, only to get destroyed. We've watched resistance happen, and we've watched sort of mindless cruelty and everything in between. It's a play that is only alive in its present tense form. And that's why reading it out loud and listening to the rhythm of the language is so pungent. So there's so much more we could say on this play, but I'm going to leave that here. And next week is The Caretaker. And just ask you quickly if there's anything you want to throw in the chat or raise your hand about that I didn't cover that you're curious about or that you wish had been covered. And while you're thinking about that, Alfredo's going to help us in case there's anybody who does have a question. I just want to say, for next week, you're going to read The Caretaker. So if the birthday party was a big failure, The Caretaker was his first huge success. To my mind, and this is only my opinion, so I'm very curious what you're going to think. I think The Birthday Party is the greater play. There are things in The Caretaker that are very heavily symbolic that I'm not sure are actually integrated into the dramatic life of the play in the same way. And I don't think that that The Caretaker has as much love and therefore surprise in a sense as it, but it is a play about brothers. It is also, I want to warn you, a play about racism. And there Pinter was very deliberate. So England after the war, there were many South Asians and Caribbean Blacks who had arrived in England. You will know of the Windrusher probably, which was a very famous ship that brought 400 West Indian Blacks to England during and right after the war. There were so many West Indians who fought for the British during the war. And yet the condition for non-white people in London after the war is, as you can imagine, it was really punishing and difficult, and partly in a slightly Trumpian way, because the British white working class was so poor after the war and so beleaguered in many ways. Prejudice of many kinds ran rampant. So enormous anti-Semitism, which we talked about before, right after the war. I mean, you know, Owsley and, you know, lots of the brown shirts marching around Hyde Park screaming anti-Semitic things, but also a period of incredibly distressing anti-Indian sentiment. This is the period of the Suez Canal and anti-Black sentiment. And so you're going to find that on the part of Davies in the Caretaker, and it's very upsetting to read. I would just say to you, you can't equate Davies' opinion with Pinter's opinion. Pinter was deeply attuned to racism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, very politicized. But in Davies, you see a character that's very disturbing and that he didn't shy away from. Douglas is asking, are there productions of The Caretaker on YouTube? You know, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm sure you could find them. Not that long ago, there was a production at the Curran Theater. It was Jonathan Pryce. I don't know if any of you went to see it, maybe about a decade ago, a touring production here in San Francisco. Jonathan Pryce was wonderful. Yeah, Bob, you mean Petey is such a kind man, a relief in this play. I think that's true. I think Petey is one of the great overlooked characters. You will find that Aston in The Caretaker also has enormous kindness. I think Pinter was really interested in people who helped other people. I think because Pinter grew up so poor, he befriended so many homeless people who lived in Hackney after the war, and knew their names and left money for people, and knew when there were old vagrant people at tube stops who didn't turn up the next day. He kind of knew that something might have happened to them. He was really nervous about that, and you know, was really loving about that. And I think that Petey, who understands, as Debbie is writing, the sense of unease about Meg's patter, I think Petey really understands, whether it's that she's single-minded or forgetful or frightened, that he can't denigrate her, that he can't just lose his temper and tell her to shut up so he can read the paper, that he has to in some way be kind to her because she's also a broken person. And I think those strategies that play out in the plays are really important. So look for that when you look at The Caretaker, what the strategies are, and also the relationship between the brothers. What a fraternal relationship really is. We're going to see this over and over again in Pinter. Very complicated relationship. Also, a very difficult reckoning with mental health. just remember, as is true in America in the 50s and 60s, that the only real way of dealing with mental health was to give people electroshock therapy. This is what happened to Tennessee Williams' sister Rose, and why he could never get over it. And it's going to come up in Williams' plays a lot. So it's interesting that in Williams and in Pinter, images of mental health crises are going to come up. And it's partly, tragically, for Pinter, very personal, because it happened with his own son, who had terrible mental health problems and it had him all his life. And there was enormous estrangement between father and son. So although the plays are quite abstract, in many ways, we're going to find out they are also quite close to the bone, quite realistic. So wonderful. Thank you for all your wonderful comments. I'm always really happy to answer them. So keep them in the chat or keep them coming. I'm so happy to engage with you that way. And next week comes The Caretaker. And if you want to sort of get one ahead, the one right after that is The Homecoming. And both are about families, particularly Jewish families. So if you are Jewish out there, Happy New Year. And fortunately, our class lands between the Jewish holidays, but I hope you celebrate well and celebrate them reading one of the great Jewish playwrights. Okay, I'll see you next week. Thank you, Alfredo.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Carrie. Hope everyone has a good week, and we'll see you all next time.
Take
Bye,
care.
everyone.